Chapter 1. The auction block. The rain fell like judgment. Alara Thorne stood beneath the stone archway of the Crimson Exchange, her infant son pressed tight against her chest, wrapped in the only blanket she still owned. The market square stretched before her, cobblestones slick with water, iron cages lining the perimeter, and shadows that moved with purpose between flickering gas lamps. This was where desperate humans came to sell what little they had left, and tonight, she was selling herself. Her husband's debts had seen to that. 3 months ago, Marcus had gambled away their home, their savings, and his own life in a card game with something that wasn't human. When they'd found his body drained in an alley, the loan contracts had transferred to her. The vampire houses didn't care about widows or infants. They cared about payment. So here she stood, 23 years old with a 3-month-old baby, waiting to be purchased like livestock. Next lot, called the auctioneer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze. Item 77. Human female, blood healthy, nursing mother, comes with dependent infant. Alara's stomach turned. Item. That's what she was now. She stepped forward onto the raised platform, rain plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. The crowd below stirred, mostly human brokers and minor house servants, but scattered among them were others, pale faces that caught the lamplight strangely, eyes that reflected gold or crimson in the dark. The vampires didn't hide here. This was their world. Humans were simply currency. Starting bid, 500 crowns, the auctioneer announced. Silence. Alara's heart sank. Too high. No one would pay that for a woman with a child in tow. She'd be sent to the workhouses instead, separated from her son, and he'd be placed in an orphanage that fed its children to the houses once they came of age. 400, she heard herself say, her voice barely audible over the rain. The auctioneer's gaze snapped to her, incredulous. You can't bid on yourself. 300 then. Her hands trembled against her son's small body. Please, I'll work harder than anyone you'd find. I can read, write, keep accounts. I was a merchant's daughter before. Rules are rules, girl. The auctioneer waved her silent. No sale tonight. Next lot, 1,000 crowns. The voice cut through the rain like a blade. Every head turned. Even the auctioneer froze. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the square. Tall, impossibly so, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and clothing that spoke of wealth older than the city itself. His coat was black wool lined with silver thread, his boots soundless on the wet stone. But it was his face that stole Alara's breath, sharp features carved from marble, skin too pale to be mortal, and eyes that gleamed like winter frost beneath dark brows. Vampire, an ancient one. If the way the crowd parted before him was any indication, he moved with the kind of grace that came from centuries of existence, crossing the square in moments that felt both too fast and perfectly measured. When he stopped at the base of the platform, his gaze lifted to Alara's face. She couldn't look away. 1,000 crowns, he repeated, his voice low and precise, carrying an accent she didn't recognize. For both, the auctioneer found his tongue. My lord, that is, you understand? The child is not blood viable for at least another 16 years. I understand what I'm purchasing. The vampire's eyes never left Alara's. Something flickered in their depths assessment, perhaps, or something closer to recognition, though they'd never met. Do you accept my offer? Why, yes, my lord. Of course, my lord. Papers appeared. The vampire signed with a hand that moved too quickly to follow, and a purse of coins exchanged hands with a weight that spoke of gold, not copper. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes, and then he was climbing the platform steps, each footfall silent despite his size, and Alara's pulse hammered in her throat. Her son stirred against her chest, whimpering, sensing her fear. The vampire stopped an arm's length away. Up close, he was even more otherworldly. No breath misted in the cold air, no heartbeat pulsed at his throat, and his skin held a luminescence that had nothing to do with the lamplight. But his eyes, they weren't cruel. They were tired, she realized. Ancient and unspeakably weary. Your name, he said quietly. Alara. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Alara Thorne. And this is Owen. His gaze dropped briefly to the baby, then back to her face. I am Cashin Morwenna, High Lord of House Morwenna. You and your son now belong to my household. You will not be harmed. You will not be separated. Those are the terms of your contract, regardless of what that paper says. Alara blinked rain from her lashes, searching his expression for the lie. There had to be one. Vampires didn't make bargains that favored humans, unless they wanted something specific, something terrible. What do you want from me? She whispered. Cashin. Morwenna was silent for a long moment, the rain falling between them like a curtain. When he finally spoke, his words held a weight that settled in her bones. Survival, he said simply. For all of us, Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and gestured toward the shadows where a carriage waited, black lacquered wood with silver fixtures and no driver she could see. Come. This place isn't safe after moonrise. We have a long journey ahead. Alara glanced back at the auction block, at the iron cages and desperate faces still waiting for buyers. Then at the vampire lord, who'd just paid a fortune for a widow and her infant son without demanding a single drop of blood. She had no other choice. Drawing Owen closer, she stepped down from the platform and followed Cash and Morwenna into the rain-soaked dark. Chapter 2. The manner of shadows. The carriage moved without horses. Alara had noticed it immediately upon entering the vehicle's smooth glide over cobblestones. The absence of reins or driver's seat, the way the shadows themselves seemed to pull it forward through the rain-darkened streets. Vampire sorcery, she supposed. Or something older than sorcery. She sat across from Cash and Morwenna, Owen, finally sleeping against her shoulder, and tried not to stare at the creature who'd purchased them both. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the Crimson Exchange. Instead, he gazed out the window at the passing city, his profile sharp against the rain-streaked glass. In the carriage's dim interior lit by a single oil lamp that burned with bluish flame, he looked even less human. No rise and fall of breath. No fidgeting or shifting weight. He simply existed in perfect, unnatural stillness. Where are you taking us? Alara finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Cashin's eyes shifted to her, that pale winter gaze, somehow both distant and intensely focused. My estate, Morwenna Hall. It lies beyond the city limits, in the old forest. How far? 2 hours by carriage. 3, if the river gates are still flooded. He paused, studying her face. You may sleep if you wish. I'll ensure no harm comes to you during transit. Alara almost laughed. Sleep, while trapped in a lightless carriage with a vampire lord and nowhere to run even if she tried. But exhaustion pulled at her bones. 3 days of hunger, fear, and her son's constant needs had left her hollowed out. Still, she forced herself to stay alert. Why did you buy us? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. 1,000 crowns for a widow with a baby. You could have purchased a blood servant for half that price. I wasn't looking for a blood servant. Then what were you looking for? Cashin was quiet for a long moment, his attention returning to the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried something. That might have been pain in a creature, capable of feeling it, someone who understands what it means to protect something, fragile in a world that wants to destroy it. Alara's breath caught. She looked down at Owen's small face, peaceful in sleep, and her arms tightened around him reflexively. This vampire, this ancient, powerful thing had somehow seen that desperation in her, had recognized it. You have a child? She asked quietly. I did, once. The words fell like stones. A very long time ago. The carriage descended into silence again. But it felt different now, heavier. Alara wanted to ask more, how a vampire could have children. What had happened to them, but the grief in those 3 words stopped her tongue. Some wounds were too old to probe. Instead, she watched the city give way to countryside through the rain-blurred window. Stone buildings became scattered cottages, then forest. The trees grew denser, older, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight penetrated the clouds. This was the Thornwood, the ancient forest where vampires had lived long before humans built their cities on its borders. Finally, the carriage began to slow. We're here, Cashin said. Though Alara could see nothing but darkness beyond the glass, the vehicle stopped with barely a whisper of movement. Cashin rose his height, forcing him to bow his head beneath the carriage roof, and opened the door. Cold air and the scent of wet earth rushed in. Stay close, he instructed. Stepping down into the night, Alara followed, clutching Owen against her chest with one arm, while using the other to steady herself on the carriage frame. Her feet touched gravel, and she looked up. Morwenna Hall rose before her like something from a fever dream. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Stone towers climbed toward the cloud-heavy sky, their peaks lost in darkness. Arched windows glowed with amber light, but the glass was thick, ancient, revealing nothing of the rooms within. Gargoyles perched along the roofline, not decorative, Alara realized with a chill, but watchful, their eyes catching the lamplight with unsettling awareness. The main entrance was a set of iron-bound doors 3 times her height, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. How old is this place? She breathed. The foundations were laid in 1-7, Cashin said, moving toward the entrance. Though the family line stretches back further. We built this hall when the human king still thought he could tax us. 700 years. Alara's mind couldn't comprehend it. Her entire family lineage barely stretched back 3 generations in recorded history. The massive door swung open without being touched, revealing an entrance hall that stole what remained of her composure. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, supported by pillars carved from black marble. Tapestries depicting battles between creatures with wings and fangs hung along the walls. and everywhere candles. Hundreds of them, burning in iron sconces and standing candelabras filling the space with flickering golden light that cast dancing shadows across stone floors, but it was empty. No servants, no guards, no movement except the candle flames. Where is everyone? Alara asked, her voice echoing. There is no one. Cashin walked deeper into the hall, his footsteps soundless. House Morwenna's bloodline has diminished. I am the last of my line. The estate is maintained by older contracts, spells woven into the stone itself. The loneliness in those words made Alara's chest ache. She'd thought herself alone when Marcus died, but this vampire had been alone for lifetimes. Centuries walking these halls with nothing but shadows and memory. You live here by yourself? She whispered. Cashin stopped at the base of a grand staircase, his back still to her. Until tonight, yes. He turned then, and something in his expression had shifted. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the echo of it. You asked what I wanted from you, Alara Thorn. The truth is simpler than you fear and more complicated than I can explain in one night. War is coming between the houses. House Theron believes I've grown too weak to defend my territory. They want Morwenna lands, Morwenna vaults, and Morwenna blood rights. If they take this estate, every human in my territories becomes theirs to drain or slaughter as they see fit. Alara's blood chilled. How many humans? Approximately 4,000 souls in the villages under my protection, 4,000 lives. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like iron. But what can I do? She looked down at Owen, at her own trembling hands. I'm nobody. I have no power, no influence. You have something far more valuable. Cashin climbed 2 steps, bringing them nearly eye level. You have the ability to walk in daylight, to move through human spaces without suspicion, to carry messages and gather intelligence where I cannot go. And you have every reason to want those 4,000 souls to survive because your son will grow up among them. Understanding dawned slowly, terribly. You want me to be your spy. I want you to be my partner in keeping this house standing. His pale eyes held hers. In exchange, you and Owen will have safety, resources, and my protection. When he comes of age, he'll inherit human lands I've held in trust for centuries. He'll never be sold, never be food, never be powerless again. Alara's heart hammered. It was an impossible offer. A dangerous one. But as she looked around the vast, lonely hall, at the vampire lord who'd paid a fortune for a widow he didn't need, she understood something crucial. Cashin Morwenna wasn't just buying a spy. He was buying hope that he didn't have to face the coming darkness alone. I'll need a bed for Owen, she said finally. And milk. And warmer blankets than what I'm carrying. Something that might have been relief flickered across Cashin's face. You'll have all of that. I'll show you to your rooms. He turned and began climbing the stairs, an Alara widow mother. And now conspirator followed him deeper into Morwenna Hall, into shadows that would either shelter her or swallow her whole. Chapter 3. The rules of Nighthrooms. Cashin led her to where on the 3rd floor. In the eastern wing, where morning light would reach first, a consideration that hadn't escaped Alara's notice. Vampires avoid the east wing during dawn hours, he explained, pushing open a heavy oak door. You'll have privacy here, safety from unwanted attention. Should other houses send scouts, the suite was larger than the entire home Alara had lost to Marcus's debts. A sitting room opened into a bedroom with an enormous 4-poster bed draped in deep burgundy velvet. Beside it sat a carved wooden cradle lined with soft blankets that looked newly placed. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the space with warmth that made Alara's cold, numb fingers ache. The cradle, she whispered, moving toward it. You prepared this before you came to the auction. Cashin stood in the doorway, not entering. I've been searching for someone suitable for 3 weeks. When I received word that a young mother was being sold tonight, I had the staff enchantments prepare appropriate accommodations. Alara carefully lowered Owen into the cradle. He stirred, but didn't wake, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. For the first time in months, she felt something close to relief. There's a bathing room through that door, Cashin continued, gesturing to the left. Hot water is drawn by speaking the command word Kalar to the tap. The wardrobe contains clothing in various sizes. Choose what fits. Food will be brought within the hour. By whom? Alara turned to face him. You said you lived alone. The hall provides. It's complicated magic. You'll grow accustomed to it. He paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. I should let you rest. Wait. The word came out before Alara could stop it. Cashin's pale gaze lifted to hers, questioning. She swallowed hard, pushing past her fear. If I'm to help you, if I'm to risk my life and my son's future on this, I need to understand what I'm walking into. Tell me about the houses. Tell me what we're facing. Cashin remained silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could bear. Then he stepped into the room, though he kept his distance. Moving to the window that overlooked the dark forest. There are 7 great houses in this region, he began. his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting ancient history. Each controls territories, human populations, and blood rights granted by treaties older than your language. House Morwenna, my house was once the most powerful. We held the largest lands, commanded the most loyalty, and served as arbiters when disputes arose between other houses. What changed? Elara asked quietly. Time, plague, war. His reflection in the window glass looked ghostly insubstantial. 300 years ago, a blood sickness swept through vampire lines. It killed indiscriminately young and old, powerful and weak. House Morwenna lost everyone except me. My wife, my children, my brothers and their families. All gone within a single winter. The grief in his words was palpable, even after 3 centuries. Elara's hand unconsciously moved to rest above her heart. I'm sorry, she whispered. The other houses saw opportunity in our weakness. They absorbed our outer territories, claimed our lesser estates, recruited our surviving human servants. I held Morwenna Hall because it's warded with protections laid down by my ancestors' magic that only Morwenna blood can undo. But my lands have shrunk to a fraction of what they were. The villages under my protection are all that remain, and House Theron wants to finish what the plague started. Cashin turned from the window to face her directly. House Theron is led by Constantine Theron, a vampire who believes in the old ways that humans are cattle, that mercy is weakness, that power justifies any cruelty. If he takes Morwenna Hall, he'll drain those 4,000 villagers within a year and repopulate the lands with humans bred specifically for blood harvest. Children raised in pens like livestock. Elara's stomach turned. That's barbaric. That's honest. Cashin's expression hardened. Most houses practice some version of it, though they hide behind prettier words. House Morwenna was founded on different principles that vampires and humans could coexist through contracts, consent, and mutual benefit. We never took unwilling blood. We protected our human populations, educated them, gave them rights under our law. It made us weak in the eyes of the other houses, but it made us just. Is that why you bought me? Elara studied his face, searching for deception. Because you need someone who'll believe in that vision. Someone desperate enough to fight for it. I bought you because you stood on that auction block clutching your infant son with the kind of fierce protection I recognize. His voice softened. Because when I saw you, I saw someone who would do anything, sacrifice anything to keep the innocent safe. That's the kind of ally I need. Not a blood servant. Not a spy. A partner who understands what we're protecting and why it matters. The weight of his words settled over Elara like a mantle. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing what kind of world her son would inherit. What do you need me to do? She asked. Cashin moved closer, though he stopped well beyond arm's reach, always maintaining that careful distance. For now, rest. Recover your strength. In 3 days, I'll need you to travel to the village of Auctioneer, the largest settlement in my territory. You'll meet with the human council there, assess their defenses, and report back on their readiness. House Theron's scouts have been seen near the borders. An attack could come within weeks, and if they attack while I'm gone? If something happens to Owen, nothing will happen to Owen. The certainty in Cashin's voice was absolute. This hall has protected Morwenna heirs for 7 centuries. It will protect your son as if he were my own blood. You have my oath on that. Elara wanted to believe him. More than that, she needed to believe him. Because the alternative was returning to that auction block. To a world where her son's future was measured in how many years until his blood became valuable to monsters like Constantine Theron. I'll go to Auctioneer, she said finally. But I need to know one more thing. Ask. Do you drink human blood? The question hung in the air between them. Cashin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, acknowledgement, perhaps, that she'd finally asked what had been haunting her since the carriage ride. Yes, he said simply. All vampires require blood to survive, but I only take from willing donors under contract, volunteers who are compensated and protected. I haven't taken unwilling blood in 500 years. How often do you need to feed? Every 3 to 4 days for optimal strength. I can survive longer, but it weakens me. He paused. I will never ask that of you, Elara. That's not part of our arrangement. You're here as a partner, not a food source. Relief flooded through her, though shame followed immediately after. She'd been terrified he would demand blood as payment, that she'd have to choose between her son's safety and her own body. Thank you, she whispered. Cashin inclined his head slightly. Food will arrive shortly. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, I'll show you the hall and explain how to navigate its protections. You'll need to understand this place if you're to live here safely. He moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold. Welcome to Morwenna Hall, Elara Thorne. I hope, in time, you'll come to see it as a sanctuary rather than a prison. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Elara stood in the firelit silence, listening to Owen's gentle breathing from the cradle. She'd traded one form of slavery for another, or had she? Cashin Morwenna wasn't what she'd expected. He was lonely, yes. Ancient and dangerous, certainly. But there was honor in him, buried beneath centuries of loss. Perhaps, she thought, they could both find something in this arrangement beyond mere survival. Perhaps they could both find redemption. Chapter 4. Threads of trust. Elara woke to sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows and the sound of Owen fussing in his cradle. For a disoriented moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back: the auction, the carriage. Cashin Morwenna's pale eyes, promising protection, she wasn't sure she could trust. She fed Owen, changed him with supplies that had appeared on the dresser while she slept, and tried not to think about invisible hands laying out fresh linens and infant clothes in the dead of night. Magic, Cashin had said. The hall provides. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. It's Cashin, came the familiar voice, muffled through oak. I've brought breakfast. May I enter? Elara glanced down at herself. She was still wearing yesterday's auction house dress, wrinkled and rain-stained. But Owen was crying for her attention, and pride seemed a luxury she couldn't afford. Come in, she called. The door opened and Cashin entered, carrying a silver tray laden with more food than Elara had seen in weeks. Fresh bread, butter, jam, sliced fruit, cheese, and a steaming pot that smelled like heaven. He set it on the small table near the window, moving with that unnatural grace that marked him as other in daylight filtering through the windows. He looked different. Paler, if that were possible, with shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there last night. He wore simpler clothing today: dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and marked with scars so old they'd faded to silver. You look tired, Elara said before she could stop herself. Cashin's lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. Daylight hours are difficult for my kind. We don't sleep as humans do, but the sun drains our strength. I'll recover at sunset. Then why are you awake now? Because you are. He gestured to the food. Eat? You barely touched dinner last night, and you'll need your strength if I'm to show you the hall today. Elara settled Owen in his cradle with a soft cloth toy that had also mysteriously appeared, then moved to the table. Her stomach growled traitorously at the sight of real food. She tore into the bread with less grace than she would have liked, and Cashin turned to the window, giving her privacy to eat without being watched. You said you'd explain the hall's protections, Elara said between bites. How does it work? The invisible servants. The doors that open themselves? Blood magic, Cashin replied, still facing the window. When House Morwenna built this estate, my ancestors bound their blood into the stone itself. The hall recognizes Morwenna blood and serves it. It anticipates needs, defends against intrusion, and maintains itself across centuries. But I'm not Morwenna blood. No, but I've added you to the hall's recognition wards. It will serve you and Owen as it serves me within limits. The deeper protections, the vault wards and the armory seals, those remain locked to my bloodline alone. Elara swallowed a bite of cheese, processing this. So the hall is alive? Aware might be a better word. It's not sentient, but it holds echoes of intent. My wife helped design the household wards. Sometimes I think the hall remembers her better than I do. The grief in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. What was her name? Elara asked softly. Cashin was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Isadora. She was human when we met. I offered her the turning after we married, after our children were born. She wanted to see them grow old, watch them have children of their own. She chose immortality for love. His hand pressed against the window glass. And then the plague took her anyway. Took all of them. Elara set down her bread, appetite fading. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. You have every right to know who you're living with. Cashin finally turned to face her. I don't speak of them often. After 300 years, most vampires forget their human families. The memories fade like old paintings. But I've held on to mine. Perhaps that's why the other houses think I've gone soft. Remembering love isn't weakness, isn't it? His pale eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In a world where power is measured in blood and brutality, compassion becomes a liability. Constantine Theron has never loved anything except his own dominance. That makes him dangerous in ways I can never match. Elara stood, moving closer to where Cashin stood by the window. Owen cooed softly from his cradle, a small sound of contentment that filled the silence. Then we'll have to be smarter than him, she said. You said I'd walk where you cannot, gather intelligence, help protect the villages. Teach me. Show me what I need to know. Something shifted in Cashin's expression: surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. You're not afraid of me anymore. I'm terrified of you, Elara corrected. But I'm more afraid of what happens to Owen if House Theron wins. Fear is a luxury I can't afford right now. Cashin studied her face for a long moment, and Elara had the strange sensation of being truly seen, not as a purchased servant or a desperate widow, but as a person with her own strength and agency. Very well, he said finally. Finish your breakfast. Then I'll show you the hall's layout, the emergency exits, and the signal system we'll use if danger approaches. After sunset, when I'm stronger, I'll teach you the basics of vampire politics, who the major players are, which houses might be swayed to neutrality, and where Theron's weaknesses lie. And tomorrow I leave for Ashenmere. The day after. I want you properly prepared first. He moved toward the door, then paused. Elara, one more thing. Yes? The hall will protect Owen with everything it has, but it cannot protect him from starvation or neglect. If you need anything for his care, milk, clothing, medicine, speak the request aloud in any room. The hall will provide. Don't hesitate because you think you're asking too much. His well-being matters to me. The sincerity in those words settled something in Elara's chest. Why? You barely know him. Because he's innocent. Because his mother was brave enough to sell herself to protect him. And because Cashin's gaze drifted to the cradle where Owen lay gurgling happily. Because I remember what it felt like to hold my own son for the first time. To know that everything I did from that moment forward was to ensure he had a better world than I'd known. He left before Elara could respond. The door closing softly behind him, she returned to the window. Looking out over the vast forest that surrounded Morwenna Hall, somewhere beyond those trees were villages full of people depending on a lonely vampire lord to protect them from monsters far worse than himself. And now, impossibly, she was part of that protection. Owen made a small sound, and Elara turned to lift him from the cradle. He gazed up at her with wide, trusting eyes, and she felt the weight of every choice she'd made settling onto her shoulders. We're going to be all right, she whispered to her son, though she wasn't sure if she was promising or praying. We're going to survive this. Behind her, she could have sworn she felt the hall itself listening. Ancient stone walls, holding centuries of memories and grief and stubborn, enduring hope, perhaps Elara thought. Cashin Morwenna wasn't the only one learning to trust again. Perhaps the hall itself was ready to believe in something beyond survival. Chapter 5. Blood on the borders. These screams shattered the pre-dawn silence. Elara jolted awake, heart hammering, instinctively reaching for Owen in his cradle. He was there, safe, still sleeping peacefully, despite the sound that had torn through the hall like a blade. Another scream followed, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside the estate walls. She scrambled from bed, pulling on the dressing gown that hung by the door, and rushed into the corridor. The hall's candles blazed to life as she ran, illuminating her path toward the main staircase. She nearly collided with Cashin at the landing. He was already dressed in dark combat leathers, a sword belted at his hip that looked older than nations. His eyes burned with an intensity she hadn't seen before, not the weary sadness of yesterday, but something primal and dangerous. Stay in your rooms, he commanded, already moving past her toward the entrance hall. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. What's happening? House Theron. The words were clipped, furious. They're attacking the border village, Ravenholm. Elara's blood turned to ice. How many people live there? 243. Cashin reached the main doors, which swung open at his approach. I'm going to get as many out as I can. You can't fight an entire house alone. He turned back to face her, and Elara saw something terrible in his expression, resignation mixed with defiance. I'm the only protection they have. This is what it means to hold a house, Elara. When they attack your people, you defend them, or you deserve to fall. Before she could argue, he was gone, moving with supernatural speed across the grounds toward the forest. Elara stood in the entrance hall, torn between the safety of her son sleeping upstairs and the knowledge that people were dying less than a mile away. She ran back to her rooms, checking that Owen was still safe, still breathing. Then she grabbed the warmest cloak she could find and made a decision that terrified her. If Cashin was going to defend those villagers, he wouldn't do it alone. The hall seemed to sense her intent. As she descended the stairs again, a side door opened that she hadn't noticed before, revealing a path that led toward the village. Lanterns lit themselves along the trail, and she heard a whisper in the air almost like encouragement. Protect. Defend. Morwenna. Elara ran. The forest blurred past her, branches catching at her cloak. She could hear sounds ahead now, shouting, crashing, the unmistakable clash of steel. Light flickered through the trees, firelight that meant buildings burning. She burst into Ravenholm's outskirts and stopped. Breath-catching in horror, the village was under siege. Houses burned along the main street. Bodies lay crumpled in doorways, some drained white, others simply broken. And everywhere, vampires moved through the chaos like deadly shadows. They wore the crimson and black of House Theron, and they hunted with casual cruelty, dragging screaming villagers from their homes. In the center of it all, Cashin fought like something out of legend. His sword was a silver blur, moving too fast for human eyes to follow. 3 Theron vampires circled him, and he held them back through sheer skill and desperation. But Alara could see the cost. He moved slower than the others, his daylight weakness still lingering even in the pre-dawn dark. Blood stained his shoulder where one had gotten through his guard. A child's cry yanked Alara's attention to the left. A girl, no more than 6, was cornered against a well by a Theron vampire. The creature smiled, fangs extending, reaching for the child with casual menace. Alara didn't think. She grabbed a fallen torch from the ground and ran. Get away from her. She swung the torch like a club, fire arcing through the darkness. The vampire hissed, jerking back from the flames. His eyes blood red and ancient locked onto Alara with instant hatred. Human, he snarled. You dare? Alara thrust the torch at his face. Vampires feared fire. Cashin had told her that much during yesterday's lessons. The creature stumbled backward, and Alara grabbed the child's hand. Run to the forest. She shouted at the girl. Go, now. The child fled, and the vampire's attention fixed entirely on Alara. Too late. She realized her mistake. She'd saved one life, but lost the weapon, keeping her alive. The torch had fallen when she'd grabbed the girl. The Theron vampire advanced, moving with predatory grace. Morwenna's new pet, I presume. Constantine will enjoy draining you slowly. Alara backed away, searching desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand closed around a piece of broken timber, charred at one end. Not much, but better than nothing. Alara. Cashin's voice cut through the chaos. She saw him break away from his opponents. Saw the desperation in his eyes as he realized she was there in danger. Exactly where she shouldn't be. The Theron vampire lunged. Alara swung the timber with everything she had. It caught the creature across the temple with a crack that reverberated through her arms. The vampire staggered, more surprised than hurt, but it gave Cashin the seconds he needed. He was there in a blur of motion, his sword taking the Theron vampire's head in one clean strike. The body crumbled to ash before it hit the ground. What are you doing here? Cashin grabbed Alara's arm, pulling her behind him as 2 more Theron vampires approached. I told you to stay at the hall, and let you die alone? Alara's voice shook, but held firm. Those people need help evacuating. I can do that while you fight. Cashin's jaw clenched. Around them, the battle raged more when a hall magic had arrived, spectral guardians rising from the earth to fight alongside their lord. But there were too many Theron attackers, and too many villagers still trapped. The church, Cashin said quickly, eyes scanning the burning village. It has stone walls and blessed ground. Theron's vampires can't enter without invitation. Get everyone you can inside. Bar the doors. Don't open them until sunrise. What about you? I'll hold them here. His pale eyes met hers, and she saw the same determination she'd shown on the auction block, the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who couldn't protect themselves. Go, please. Alara nodded and ran toward the village center, shouting for survivors. People emerged from hiding, terrified families, wounded men, crying children. She herded them toward the church, a stone building with a bell tower that still stood intact amid the burning homes. Inside. Everyone inside. An elderly woman clutched Alara's sleeve. What about Lord Cashin? He can't fight them all. He's giving us time. Move. Alara pushed the last villager through the church doors and turned to look back. Cashin stood in the village square, surrounded by Theron vampires, his sword singing through the air. Blood his own and theirs painted the cobblestones. He was magnificent and terrifying, a warrior who'd survived centuries of battles, but even legends could fall. One of the Theron vampires broke away from the fight, racing toward the church with inhuman speed. Alara's breath caught. If it reached the doors before she could bar them, she slammed the heavy oak doors closed and dropped the iron bar into place just as the vampire crashed against them from outside. The wood shuddered, but held, the blessed ground, repelling the creature's attempts to break through. Inside, 47 villagers huddled together in the darkness, lit only by altar candles. Alara sank against the door, heart pounding, and prayed to God she'd stopped believing in. Let him survive. Let dawn come quickly. Let this not be the night house Morwenna falls. Outside, the sounds of battle raged on, and Alara realized with terrible clarity that everything had changed. She wasn't just Cashin's purchased servant anymore, she was his ally, his partner in this desperate fight, and she would not let him face the darkness alone. Chapter 6. The blood oath. Dawn broke like salvation. The first rays of sunlight pierced the smoke-filled sky, and Alara heard the Theron vampires retreat with hisses of fury. Their footsteps faded into the forest, leaving behind a village that looked like a battlefield from some ancient war. Alara waited 5 minutes after the sounds disappeared before lifting the iron bar from the church doors. She stepped out into gray morning light, her stomach churning at the destruction spread before her. Half the village had burned. Bodies lay in the streets, some villagers who hadn't made it to safety, others the ash remains of Theron vampires Cashin had killed. The air reeked of smoke, blood, and death, and in the center of the square, Cashin knelt on the cobblestones. Alara's heart lurched. She ran to him, falling to her knees beside his crumpled form. His sword lay a few feet away, the blade dark with blood. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and deep gashes marked his chest and shoulders where Theron claws had torn through his leathers. Cashin, she touched his face carefully. His skin was colder than usual and his eyes were closed. Cashin, can you hear me? His eyes opened slowly, those pale irises now rimmed with red. You should have stayed at the hall, he whispered, voice rough with pain and exhaustion. Owen needs his mother. Owen is safe. The hall is protecting him. Alara's hands hovered over his wounds, unsure where to touch without causing more harm. What do I do? How do I help you? You can't. Cashin tried to sit up and failed, collapsing back with a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Vampire healing requires blood. Strong blood. And I'm too weak to hunt. Behind them, villagers began emerging from the church. An older man, the one Alara recognized as the village blacksmith, approached cautiously. Lord Cashin, he said, voice shaking. We feared you'd fallen. Not yet. Thomas, Cashin's attempt at a reassuring smile came out as more of a grimace. How many did we lose? 19 dead that we've counted so far. Another dozen injured. Thomas's weathered face crumpled. But you saved the rest. 47 souls sheltered in the church, plus those who fled to the forest. You saved us, my lord. I should have saved them all. The anguish in Cashin's voice cut through Alara like a knife. I should have anticipated Theron would strike at dawn when I'm weakest. I should have. You did everything you could. Alara interrupted firmly. She turned to Thomas. Help me get him back to the hall. He needs blood. Thomas finished quietly. My lord needs to feed to heal. The old man rolled up his sleeve without hesitation. Take mine. Take as much as you need. No, Cashin's voice was absolute, despite his weakness. You're 70 years old, Thomas. The loss would kill you. I won't. I'm strong enough. And I owe you my life a dozen times over. Thomas, I said no. Alara watched the exchange, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. Cashin would rather die than take blood that might harm an innocent. It was the same stubborn honor that made him vulnerable to predators like Constantine Theron, but it was also what made him worth saving. Take mine. Alara said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her. Absolutely not, Cashin said immediately. You're nursing an infant. You need every drop of blood you have. I'm young and healthy. I can spare what you need to heal. Alara met his gaze steadily. You said it yourself, we're partners in this fight. That means when you fall, I help you stand. No arguments. Cashin's expression shifted through a dozen emotions: protest, concern, something that might have been gratitude, and beneath it all, desperate need. Alara, you don't understand what you're offering. Vampire feeding creates connections, blood bonds. It's not something to be done lightly. Will it hurt Owen? Make me weaker as his mother? No, but then we're doing this. Alara knelt closer, rolling up her sleeve to expose her wrist. Show me how. For a long moment, Cashin simply stared at her offered arm. Then, with movements that spoke of centuries of practiced restraint, he took her wrist gently in his uninjured hand. It will hurt at first, he warned. Then the venom will take effect, and it will feel different. Tell me if you want me to stop. Alara nodded. Not trusting her voice, Cashin's fangs extended delicate and deadly, and he pressed them to the pulse point of her wrist. The initial pierce was sharp, making Alara gasp. But then warmth flooded through her veins, spreading from the bite up her arm and into her chest. It didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it felt like sinking into warm water, like safety and surrender, and something far more complicated that she didn't have words for. She could feel Cashin's presence somehow, not physically, but deeper. His exhaustion, his pain, his fierce determination to protect what remained of his people. And beneath all of that, loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. 300 years alone, she thought hazily. 300 years carrying this burden with no one to share it. Cashin pulled away after what might have been seconds or minutes. Alara couldn't tell. He pressed his thumb over the bite marks, and she felt a cool tingle as vampire venom sealed the wounds, leaving only 2 small pink marks. Thank you, he whispered. And the raw vulnerability in his voice made something shift in Alara's heart. Already, she could see the difference. Color, or what passed for color in a vampire's pale complexion, returned to his face. The gashes on his chest began to close, skin knitting back together with visible speed. His broken arm straightened with a series of soft cracks that made Alara wince. We need to get you both back to the hall, Thomas said practically. More Theron scouts could return, and Lord Cashin needs proper rest. Cashin stood slowly, testing his newly healed limbs. He swayed slightly, and Alara moved to support him without thinking. He was so much taller that the gesture was almost comical, but he leaned into her touch anyway. The village needs to be evacuated, Cashin said to Thomas. Anyone who wants sanctuary at Morwenna Hall can come. We'll make room. I won't leave them exposed to another attack. I'll organize the survivors, Thomas promised. We'll follow within the hour. The walk back to the hall took twice as long as Alar's desperate run to the village. Cashin moved carefully, his strength returning, but not yet fully restored. Neither of them spoke, but Alara was acutely aware of the blood bond humming between them, a connection that felt intimate in ways she wasn't ready to examine. When Morwenna Hall finally came into view, Alara felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. The ancient estate stood unchanged, eternal, and somewhere inside, Owen was safe. You saved my life today, Cashin said as they approached the entrance. Twice. Once by bringing the villagers to safety, and once by offering your blood when I had no right to ask for it. You didn't ask. I offered. Alara helped him up the stone steps. That's what partners do. Cashin stopped at the threshold, turning to face her fully. In the morning light, he looked almost human, tired, grateful, and touched by something that might have been hope. I've lived for 843 years, he said softly. I've known warriors, scholars, leaders, and lovers, but I've never met anyone quite like you. Alara Thorne. Before she could respond, he continued into the hall, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart beating too fast and her wrist still tingling where his fangs had pierced her skin. The blood bond whispered between them, and Alara knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. They weren't just allies anymore. They were bound by something far more dangerous than any contract. They were bound by choice. Chapter 7. Sanctuary and Secrets. Morwenna Hall transformed over the next 3 days. What had been a lonely fortress became a refuge. 47 villagers from Ravenholm arrived in waves, families with children, elderly couples, young men and women who'd lost everything to house Theron's attack. The hall's magic expanded to accommodate them, opening unused wings that had stood empty for centuries, preparing rooms, providing food and warmth. Alara found herself in the unexpected role of mistress of the household, coordinating sleeping arrangements, organizing meal schedules, and comforting traumatized survivors. The villagers looked to her with a trust that terrified her, not because she didn't want to help, but because she'd been in their position just days ago, desperate and powerless. But she had Cashin now, and the hall, and something she hadn't expected. Purpose. She was in the main kitchen, a cavernous space with hearths large enough to roast whole animals helping prepare evening meals. When Cashin found her, "There you are," he said from the doorway. "I've been searching for an hour." Alara looked up from the vegetables she'd been chopping, surprised. Cashin had been scarce since the attack, spending most of his time in what he called the war room, planning defenses and sending messages to other houses. She'd seen him only briefly each evening when he checked on Owen, and even then, he'd seemed distracted, distant. The children needed feeding, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. And someone had to organize the food stores. The hall provides, but it works better when we're specific about requests. Cashin's expression was unreadable. You've been working yourself to exhaustion. The servants tell me you sleep only a few hours each night. The invisible servants are reporting on me. They're concerned. As am I. He stepped into the kitchen, and the other women working there quietly excused themselves, sensing a private conversation brewing. Alara, you're not obligated to manage my household. That wasn't part of our arrangement. Someone needs to do it. And you've been busy planning how to keep us all alive. She set down her knife, meeting his gaze. Besides, these people look at you like you're their salvation. But they don't know how to talk to a vampire lord who's 8 centuries old. I'm the bridge. I can be human enough to understand them, and close enough to you to be trusted. Something flickered in Cashin's pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You've thought about this. I've thought about very little else. Alara crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how plain she must look in her work dress, with flour dusting her sleeves. You said you needed a partner who could walk where you cannot. Well, I'm walking. These people are part of your territory, your responsibility. If I can help them feel safe here, then I'm doing exactly what you hired me for. Cashin was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach, as he always did, maintaining that careful distance. I didn't hire you to sacrifice your own well-being, he said softly. Owen needs you, and I need you sharp and rested, not running yourself into the ground trying to be everything to everyone. Then help me. The words came out more desperate than Alara intended. Teach me what I need to know. Not just about vampire politics and house alliances, but about this. She gestured around the kitchen, the hall beyond. How to manage a household this size. How to organize defenses. How to be useful instead of just scattered. Cashin studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. The blood bond hummed between them, and she knew he could sense her exhaustion, her determination, the fear she tried so hard to hide. Very well, he said finally. But first, you're going to rest. A full night's sleep. No arguments. The hall will manage dinner without you. Cashin, that's an order, not a request. His voice held quiet authority. Tomorrow evening, after sunset, when I'm at full strength, I'll begin teaching you everything you need to know. Estate management, defensive strategies, vampire law. But tonight, you rest. Alara wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the attack, haunted by memories of burning buildings and the sensation of Cashin's fangs piercing her wrist. Fine, she conceded. But only if you promise to actually teach me. No more avoiding me because the blood bond makes things complicated. Cashin's expression shifted, caught between denial and acknowledgement. How did you? I can feel it too. Alara touched her wrist unconsciously, where the bite marks had faded to nearly invisible scars. The connection. It's like knowing where you are in the hall without seeing you. Feeling your moods at the edges of my awareness. It's disconcerting. Blood bonds fade if not reinforced, Cashin said carefully. In a few weeks you'll barely notice it. Do you want it to fade? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to address. Cashin's jaw tightened, and Alara saw the war playing out across his features: desire versus duty, longing versus self-preservation. What I want is irrelevant, he said finally. You're here to help me save my people, not to be bound to a creature who will outlive you by centuries. The bond was a necessity, nothing more. The words should have been a relief. Instead, they stung in ways Alara didn't want to examine. Of course, she said quietly. Nothing more. She turned back to the vegetables, needing something to do with her hands. Behind her, she heard Cashin take a breath. He didn't need an old human habit that surfaced in moments of emotion. Alara, I didn't mean you should go. She kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. You have planning to do, and I have rest to get, apparently. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Cashin's footsteps retreated, leaving Alara alone in the vast kitchen, with her racing heart and the ghost of his presence still humming through the blood bond. She pressed her palm against the counter, trying to steady herself. This was foolish, dangerous. She was a widow with an infant son, purchased at auction to serve a practical purpose. Whatever she'd felt during the feeding, that rush of intimacy, the sense of belonging, was just vampire venom and her own desperate loneliness. Nothing more, but the bond whispered otherwise, carrying echoes of Cashin's emotions, regret, longing, fear of causing her harm. You're being ridiculous, she told herself firmly. He's a vampire. You're human. The only thing between you is a contract and survival. A soft sound made her turn. Owen's cry drifted down from her chambers upstairs, time for his evening feeding. Alara wiped her hands and headed for the stairs, grateful for the distraction. She found her son awake and fussy in his cradle, the hall, having already changed him and prepared warm milk. As she settled into the rocking chair to feed him, Alara let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if things were different, if she and Cashin had met under other circumstances, if he weren't immortal and haunted by centuries of loss, if she weren't bound by desperation and duty. Would he look at her the way he had in the kitchen, that moment of unguarded want before the walls came back up? Would she be brave enough to reach for something beyond mere survival? Owen's small hand wrapped around her finger, anchoring her to reality. This was what mattered, keeping her son safe, helping Cashin defend the innocents under his protection. Everything else was fantasy. The blood bond pulsed softly, and Alara could feel Cashin somewhere in the hall below, working in his war room, planning strategies. Carrying the weight of too many lives on shoulders that had already borne centuries of grief, she sent a thought through the bond. Not sure if he could receive it. You're not alone anymore. The bond shivered, and she felt his response, not words, but emotion, gratitude, hope, and beneath it all, a longing so profound it made her chest ache. Tomorrow, they would begin her training. Tomorrow, she would learn how to be the partner he needed. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, with her son in her arms, Alara allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could both learn to want something more than survival, something like healing, something like home. Chapter 8. Lessons in Shadow. War room occupied the hall's western tower, accessible only through a hidden staircase that revealed itself when Cashin placed his palm against a section of bare stone wall. Blood recognition, he explained as the stone rippled and reformed into a doorway. Only more when a bloodline, or those I've personally keyed into the wards, can enter. You now have access. Alara followed him up the spiral stairs, Owen secured in a sling against her chest. She'd refused to leave him with the hall's magic again, not after 3 days of near constant separation. Cashin hadn't argued. The war room itself stole her breath. Maps covered every surface, ancient parchments showing territories that no longer existed alongside newer charts marking current house boundaries. A massive table dominated the center, carved from black wood and inlaid with silver lines that glowed faintly in the candlelight. Along the walls, weapons hung in careful arrangement, swords, daggers, crossbows that looked like they belonged in museums. This was my father's command center, Cashin said, moving to the table. And his father's before him. Every major decision in House Morwenna's history was made in this room. Elara approached the table slowly, studying the map spread across its surface. She recognized some landmarks: the forest, the river, villages she'd heard named. But much of it was foreign, marked with symbols she didn't understand. The red territories are House Theron's holdings, Cashin explained, pointing to a large swath of land north of Morwenna borders. The blue is House Valence. They're neutral, mostly interested in trade, not conquest. Gold is House Kale, green is House Dreven. Each color represents a different power block, and the black? Elara indicated the scattered dark patches across the map, contested territories. Places where houses have been destroyed or absorbed, leaving power vacuums. Dangerous lands where anything can happen. His finger traced the borders around Morwenna holdings, a much smaller area than the others, she noticed. We're surrounded on 3 sides. The river protects us to the east, but Theron holds the north, Kale the west, and Dreven the south. How have you survived this long? Carefully. And by making myself too costly to attack directly. Cashin pulled out a second map, this one showing underground passages. Morwenna Hall has escape routes, hidden armories, and defensive wards that have kept us safe for centuries. But wards require power to maintain, and power requires blood. My blood, specifically. The weaker I become, the weaker the hall's protections. Elara studied the underground passages, committing them to memory. The attack on Ravenholm, was that a test? Precisely. Cashin's expression darkened. Constantine wanted to see how quickly I could respond, how much strength I still possessed. He learned I can still fight, but that I'm vulnerable during daylight hours. Next time, he'll plan accordingly. When will next time be? Soon, within 2 weeks, I'd estimate. He'll want to strike before I can reinforce my defenses or call in favors from neutral houses. Elara's hand unconsciously moved to protect Owen, who dozed peacefully against her chest, oblivious to the danger being discussed around him. What can I do? Cashin pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting in multiple languages. This contains the names of every village leader, merchant, guild master, and influential human in Morwenna territories. Tomorrow, you'll begin visiting them, learn their concerns, assess their loyalty, and determine who can be trusted to gather intelligence. You want me to build a spy network? I want you to build a community. Cashin's pale eyes met hers with intensity. House Theron sees humans as resources to be exploited. I need our people to understand that Morwenna sees them as partners worth protecting. Your role is to embody that difference, to be living proof that humans have value in my house beyond their blood. The weight of responsibility settled over Elara's shoulders. And if I fail? If they don't trust me? Then we lose. Cashin's brutal honesty was almost refreshing. I can defend the hall indefinitely, but I can't protect scattered villages against coordinated attacks. If the humans in my territories don't believe I'm worth fighting for, they'll surrender to Theron rather than risk being caught in the crossfire. I need you to give them a reason to stand with us. Elara looked down at the map, at the tiny markers representing thousands of lives. She thought of Thomas the blacksmith, of the families now sheltering in the hall, of Owen's future in a world ruled by creatures like Constantine Theron. Teach me everything, she said quietly. Not just the practical things: estate management and defensive strategy. Teach me vampire politics. How houses negotiate, what leverage we have, where Theron is vulnerable. If I'm going to represent you to your people, I need to understand your world completely. Cashin studied her for a long moment, and Elara felt the blood bond pulse with something that might have been pride. Very well. We'll start with the Covenant of Houses. He spent the next hour explaining the intricate web of vampire law, ancient agreements that governed how houses interacted, the rules around territory disputes, the protocols for blood rights and feeding contracts. Elara's head spun with information, but she absorbed every word. Asking questions when things became unclear, the key weakness in Theron's position, Cashin said, pointing to a section of contested territory, is that he's overstretched. He's absorbed 3 smaller houses in the last decade, and their former territories are restless. If we can create enough instability in his holdings, he'll have to pull forces back to maintain control. How do we create instability? A smile ghosted across Cashin's lips, the first genuine one Elara had seen from him. That's where your spy network comes in. Information is power in vampire politics. If we know which of Theron's vassals are unhappy, which human populations are being mistreated, we can exploit those fractures. You want to incite rebellion in his territories. I want to remind his people that they have choices. Cashin's expression grew serious again. Revolution is costly. People will die. But if we do nothing, many more will die when Theron eventually conquers Morwana lands. Sometimes the ethical choice is deciding which tragedy we can live with, the brutal calculus of war. Ilara had never imagined herself in a position to make such decisions, but here she was, discussing rebellion and sacrifice with an 800-year-old vampire while her infant son slept against her heart. There's something else you need to understand, Cashin said quietly. About the blood bond. Ilara's pulse quickened. You said it would fade. It will if we let it. But there's another option. He moved closer, near enough that she could see the faint silver flecks in his pale eyes. Blood bonds can be strengthened through regular feeding. They create a connection that allows for communication across distance, shared strength in battle, even the ability to sense danger to the bonded partner. That sounds useful for our situation. It is. But it also creates complications. Cashin's hand lifted, then fell back to his side, as if he'd stopped himself from reaching for her. The bond intensifies emotions. What you feel becomes sharper, more vivid. And the connection goes both ways. I would feel your emotions as clearly as you feel mine. Ilara understood what he wasn't saying. The bond would strip away the careful distance they'd been maintaining, exposing every complicated feeling simmering beneath the surface. Would it hurt, Owen? She asked. Would maintaining the bond take blood I need for nursing? No, the amount required is minimal, less than you'd lose to a minor injury. Then I think we should strengthen it. Ilara spoke before she could second guess herself. You said information is power. Well, being able to communicate across distance, to know if the other is in danger, that's a tactical advantage we can't afford to dismiss. Cashin's expression was unreadable. You're certain? Are you trying to talk me out of it? I'm trying to ensure you understand what you're agreeing to. A strengthened blood bond is intimate in ways that go beyond the physical. You'll know my fears, my regrets, He stopped, jaw tightening. You'll know more of me than I've allowed anyone to know in 300 years. The vulnerability in those words made Ilara's decision easier. Then we'll both be exposed. Equally. That seems fair. For a long moment, Cashin simply looked at her. And Ilara saw the war playing out in his eyes, the loneliness of centuries battling against the fear of attachment. The desperate need for connection, struggling against the certainty of eventual loss. Finally, he extended his hand. Once a week then. Just enough to maintain the bond's strength. We'll start tomorrow evening. Ilara took his hand, feeling the cool press of his skin against hers. The bond hummed between them, anticipatory, and she knew that tomorrow would change everything. Again, but perhaps, she thought, change was exactly what they both needed. Chapter 9. The second Seagoth attack came at midnight, exactly as Cashin had predicted. Ilara woke to the hall's warning, a deep, resonant tolling that vibrated through the stone walls like a heartbeat. She was on her feet instantly, scooping Owen from his cradle and wrapping him in blankets. The blood bond flared hot and urgent. Danger, prepare, protect. Her door burst open. Cashin stood in the threshold, already armed with his sword and wearing the same dark leathers from the Ravenholm attack. They're at the gates, he said, voice clipped and controlled. 40 vampires, maybe more. Theron himself is leading them. Ilara's blood ran cold. The villagers are being moved to the lowest levels. The catacombs beneath the hall are warded with protections that even Constantine can't break. Cashin moved into the room, his presence filling the space. You need to go with them. Take Owen and no. Ilara secured Owen in his sling, then grabbed the knife she'd taken to keeping beside her bed. You said you needed a partner. Partners don't hide while the other fights. Ilara, this isn't Ravenholm. This is a full assault on the hall itself. Then you need every advantage you can get. She met his gaze steadily, ignoring the terror clawing at her throat. The bond, can you use it to coordinate with me during the battle? Cashin's expression shifted, understanding dawning. Yes, but then I'll be your eyes where you can't look. Your voice where you can't reach. She moved toward him, close enough to see the war in his eyes. You taught me the hall's layout, the defensive positions, the emergency protocols. Let me use that knowledge. Another toll shook the hall. Cashin's jaw clenched, seconds ticking past as he weighed options. Finally, he nodded sharply. Stay in the eastern wing. There's a balcony overlooking the main approach. You can see the battlefield from there without being exposed. Use the bond to tell me what you see. Troop movements, flanking attempts, anything I might miss in close combat. And Owen? Cashin pressed his palm against the wall, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small chamber barely larger than a closet. Put him here. The hall will protect him with everything it has. Nothing can breach this sanctuary except Morwana blood. Ilara's hands shook as she kissed Owen's forehead and laid him gently in the hidden chamber. He fussed, but didn't wake, and she forced herself to step back as the panel sealed shut. Safe, the hall seemed to whisper. Protected, guarded. Come, Cashin said, taking her hand. Quickly, they ran through corridors lit by emergency candles that burned with blue flame. The hall's defensive enchantments were activating. Alara could feel them humming through the stone. Ancient magic stirring after centuries of dormancy. Cashin brought her to the eastern balcony, a stone platform that overlooked the hall's front approach. Below, the grounds were chaos. Theron's forces had breached the outer gates. Vampires in crimson and black swarmed across the courtyard, moving with inhuman speed toward the main entrance. But the hall fought back. Spectral guardians rose from the earth, warriors forged from memory and magic, engaging the attackers with desperate ferocity, and in the center of it all, directing his troops with cold precision, stood Constantine Theron. He was beautiful in the way catastrophes were beautiful, tall and perfectly proportioned, with golden hair and features that could have been carved by master sculptors. But his eyes burned red with bloodlust, and when he smiled, his fangs gleamed like polished bone. "There," Alara said, gripping the balcony railing. "Their left flank is weaker. 5 vampires versus 8 of your guardians." Through the bond, she felt Cashin's acknowledgement. He was somewhere below, already engaging enemy forces. She could sense his focus, his battle calm, the razor-sharp awareness of a warrior who'd survived centuries of combat. "North Tower," she sent through the bond. 3 vampires climbing. "They're trying to bypass your front defenses." She felt Cashin's response, not words, but intent. Moments later, the 3 climbers fell, struck down by enchanted arrows that launched from hidden emplacements. The battle raged. Alara forced herself to watch, cataloging movements and sending information through the bond. Her hands gripped the railing so hard her knuckles went white, and every time she felt Cashin take a hit through the bond, pain blooming sharp and bright, her heart stuttered. "I'm fine," he sent back, sensing her fear. "Focus. Where is Constantine?" Alara scanned the courtyard. Theron had disappeared from view, and dread pooled in her stomach. "He's going for a side entrance," she breathed, then louder through the bond. "Cashin, he's flanking. West side, near the old chapel." She felt Cashin's surge of alarm, felt him disengage from his current fight and race toward the west wing. But he was too far away, she realized with horror. Theron would reach the entrance before a figure stepped from the shadows near the chapel door. Thomas, the old blacksmith from Ravenholm, holding a crossbow that looked ancient and deadly. "No," Alara whispered. "Thomas, run." But the old man stood his ground. When Constantine Theron rounded the corner, moving faster than human eyes could track, Thomas fired. The bolt took Theron in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to make the vampire lord stagger. Enough to buy Cashin the seconds he needed. Cashin hit Theron like a storm, his sword singing through the air. The 2 vampire lords collided with a force that cracked the courtyard stones, and Alara watched with her heart in her throat as they fought. Constantine was younger, faster, his movements liquid and precise. But Cashin had centuries of experience, and he fought with the desperate strength of someone protecting everything he had left. The bond flooded Alara with sensation, Cashin's exertion, his determination, and beneath it all, a whisper of thought. "For them. For the innocents. For her. Behind you." Alara screamed through the bond as 2 Theron vampires broke away from the main battle to aid their lord. Cashin spun, his blade, taking one's head. But the second got through, his guard, claws raking across his ribs. Alara felt his pain like it was her own, gasping and nearly doubling over. Through the bond, she sent everything she had, her strength, her will, her absolute refusal to let him fall. "Get up, fight. You don't get to die and leave us alone." She felt Cashin's response, surprise, then something fiercer. He surged to his feet, fighting with renewed fury, driving back both Constantine and the remaining attacker. The battle's tide was turning. Theron's forces were falling back, their numbers depleted by the hall's guardians and the unexpected resistance from the human villagers who'd taken up weapons to defend their sanctuary. Constantine Theron stood in the center of the courtyard, blood staining his perfect features, his red eyes blazing with fury. "This isn't over, Morwenna," he shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "You've won tonight, but you're dying by inches. Your house is finished, your bloodline extinct. All you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. Then come back tomorrow," Cashin called back, his voice steady despite his wounds. "And the day after. And every day until you understand that Morwenna Hall will never fall while I still draw breath." Constantine's smile was terrible. "We'll see how long that breath lasts." He vanished into the darkness, his remaining forces retreating with him. Within minutes, the courtyard was empty except for ash, bodies, and Cashin's spectral guardians slowly fading back into the earth. Alara ran. She flew through the hall's corridors, following the bond like a compass, and found Cashin in the main entrance hall. He was leaning against a pillar, one hand pressed to his bleeding ribs, his sword still clutched in the other. "You're hurt," she said, rushing to his side. "I'm alive. Thanks to you." He looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made the bond between them sing. "You were brilliant. Your information saved lives tonight. Thomas saved your life. Thomas fired because he saw you on the balcony, watching over us all. Because he knew Morwenna Hall had someone who cared enough to stand guard. Cashin's hand lifted to her face, hovering just short of touching. You've given these people hope, Alara. You've given me. He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, caught behind the walls he kept so carefully maintained, but Alara felt it through the bond anyway. You've given me a reason to believe tomorrow is worth fighting for. Footsteps echoed from the hidden sanctuary. The villagers were emerging, frightened but alive, ready to help with the wounded and the dead, and in the eastern wing, Alara knew Owen slept safely in his magical sanctuary, protected by ancient wards and a vampire lord who'd proven he would die before letting the innocent fall. This was just the beginning, wasn't it? Alara asked quietly. Cashin's hand finally dropped, and he straightened despite his wounds. Yes, Constantine won't stop until one of us is destroyed. Then we'll have to make sure it's him, through the bond. She felt Cashin's surprise and then, finally, the beginning of trust that went deeper than contracts or necessity. They had survived the night, but the real war was just beginning. Chapter 10. The Choice. 3 weeks after the siege, Alara stood in Cashin's private study, watching him draft a letter that could change everything. House Valence has agreed to mediation, he said, not looking up from the parchment. Constantine can't refuse without appearing weak to the other houses. We'll meet on neutral ground in 7 days. Alara moved closer to the desk, studying the elegant script flowing from his pen. The blood bond had grown stronger since the battle. They fed it weekly now, and the connection between them had deepened into something that felt less like magic and more like inevitability. What happens at mediation? She asked. We negotiate. Constantine will demand territorial concessions. I'll refuse. House Valence will propose compromises that favor whoever they believe will win. Cashin finally looked up, and Alara saw the exhaustion etched into his features. The real question is what I'm willing to sacrifice to buy time. You've already sacrificed everything, not everything. His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Not yet. Before Alara could ask what he meant, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. My lord, there's someone at the gates requesting sanctuary. A vampire. She says she's defecting from House Theron. Cashin was on his feet instantly. Describe her. Young-looking, dark hair, wearing Theron colors but they're torn. She's wounded badly. Claims she has information about Constantine's next move. Through the bond, Alara felt Cashin's suspicion warring with hope. Defectors were rare, and almost always traps. Bring her to the main hall, Cashin ordered. Under full guard. Search her for weapons and binding contracts. 20 minutes later, they stood in the entrance hall facing a female vampire who looked barely older than Alara. Her dark hair was matted with blood, and deep gashes marked her arms and face, wounds that should have healed by now but hadn't. Silver poisoning, Cashin said quietly, recognizing the symptoms. Someone didn't want you to recover. The vampire she'd given her name as Siren nodded weakly. Constantine discovered I'd been feeding his human servants information about planned raids. He sentenced me to silver chains and starvation. I escaped 3 days ago. Why come here? Because House Morwenna is the only one that might value what I know. Siren's eyes dark brown, not the red of Theron vampires, lifted to Cashin's. Constantine is planning something catastrophic. Not just another attack on your borders. He's negotiating with House Dreven to launch a coordinated assault. They'll strike from 2 sides simultaneously, overwhelming your defenses. Alara felt Cashin's alarm spike through the bond. House Dreven commanded nearly twice Theron's forces. Together, they could crush Morwenna Hall. When? Cashin demanded. Immediately after the mediation. Constantine will use the peace talks to position his troops. The moment he returns from neutral ground, the attack begins. That's 6 days from now. 5. Siren corrected. The mediation is a trap, my lord. He's not negotiating in good faith. Cashin paced to the window, his mind racing. Through the bond, Alara felt him calculating odds, running through scenarios, finding every possible outcome bleak. We can't win a two-front war, she said quietly. Even with the hall's defenses. No, Cashin's voice was hollow. We can't. Siren stumbled, catching herself against a pillar. Her wounds were worsening. Silver poisoning left untreated would eventually kill even a vampire. She needs blood to heal, Alara said. Strong blood. Cashin turned to look at the defector, weighing trust against necessity. Finally, he rolled up his sleeve. Mine, but you'll be bound by hall law while you're here. No feeding on unwilling humans. No violence against innocents. Agreed. Siren moved toward him carefully, and Cashin extended his wrist. Alara watched the feeding with a strange mixture of emotions, practical understanding warring with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. The bond pulsed with her feelings, and she saw Cashin's eyes flick toward her even as Siren drank. When it was done, Color had returned to Siren's face and her wounds were closing. She bowed deeply to Cashin. I owe you my life, Lord Morwenna. I'll fight for this house if you'll have me. You can start by telling me everything you know about Dreven's forces, Cashin said. Thomas, get her food and a room. Alara, with me. He swept from the hall toward the war room. And Alara followed, the bond thrumming with urgency and something darker desperation in the tower. Cashin pulled out maps with sharp, angry movements. 5 days. We have 5 days to prepare for an assault that will bring at least 80 vampires against our walls. Can we call for help? Other houses? House Valence won't risk Theron's wrath. House Kale is too distant and too cautious. Cashin's hands pressed against the table. We're alone in this, just as we've always been. Alara studied the maps, her mind working through impossible problems. What if we evacuate? Take the villagers and run before the attack comes? Run? Where? Theron controls the north, Dreven the south, Kale the west. The river to the east is impassable this time of year. Cashin's voice cracked slightly. There's nowhere to run, Alara. Nowhere. That wouldn't mean abandoning everything my family built over 7 centuries. Then we fight. We'll lose. Maybe. Alara moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Or maybe we find a way to make the cost too high. You said Constantine is overstretched, that his territories are restless. What if we strike first? Not at his armies, but at his foundations? Cashin looked at her sharply. What are you suggesting? You wanted me to build a network in your territories. I have. Thomas and the other village leaders have connections across the border, traders, servants, people who move between houses without attracting attention. She pointed to the map. What if we use them to spread information? Tell Theron's human populations what's coming. Give them a choice. Stand with the Lord who sees them as cattle, or rise up while his forces are occupied here. You're talking about revolution. About turning Theron's own people against him. I'm talking about giving them the same choice you gave me. Alara met his gaze steadily. A chance to fight for something better than slavery. Through the bond, she felt Cashin's mind racing, considering possibilities. It would be chaos. People would die. Innocents caught in the crossfire. People are already dying. At least this way, they die fighting for their freedom instead of being drained in the dark. Cashin was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a fresh map, this one showing Theron territories in detail. If we incite rebellion, we need to be strategic. Target the settlements where discontent is highest, where Theron's control is weakest. His finger traced locations. Here, and here. These villages have had recent uprisings that were brutally suppressed. The humans there have reason to hate Constantine. Can we get messages to them in 5 days? With the network you've built? Possibly. Cashin looked at her with something like awe. You understand what you're proposing? This isn't just intelligence gathering anymore. This is war. We're already at war. We're just choosing to fight smart instead of waiting to be slaughtered. A slow smile curved Cashin's lips, the first genuine one Alara had seen since the siege. 3 weeks ago, you stood on an auction block with nothing but desperation and your son. Now you're planning revolutions. 3 weeks ago, I was alone. Alara's hand moved without conscious thought, covering his on the map. I'm not alone anymore. The touch sent electricity through the bond. And suddenly they were standing too close, breathing the same air. Connected by more than strategy and survival. Alara, Cashin said softly, his free hand lifting to her face. This time, he didn't stop himself from touching. His fingers traced her jaw with infinite gentleness. I need to tell you something before the mediation. Before whatever comes next. What? If we survive this, if by some miracle we win, I want to offer you a choice. His thumb brushed across her cheek. The turning, immortality, not as payment or obligation, but as a possibility. For you, and eventually for Owen, when he's old enough to choose. Alara's breath caught. Why? Because I've lived 800 years, and I've never met anyone who made me believe tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Until you. The vulnerability in his voice was absolute. I'm not asking for an answer now. I just needed you to know that the option exists. That if you wanted, Alara kissed him. She didn't plan it. Didn't think about consequences or complications. She simply rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, cutting off words that were tearing her heart apart. For a heartbeat, Cashin froze. Then he kissed her back with a hunger that spoke of 3 centuries of loneliness finally finding reprieve. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. And the blood bond blazed between them like wildfire. Every emotion, every desperate hope, every terrified dream they'd both been too afraid to acknowledge. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard despite one of them not needing to breathe. Cashin rested his forehead against hers. That wasn't an answer to my question, he whispered. Ask me again after we win, Alara replied. After we've saved your people and stopped Constantine. Ask me when we know what tomorrow looks like. And if there is no tomorrow? Then we'll make tonight count. Through the bond. She felt his response, love and fear and determination all tangled together into something too complex for words. They had 5 days to prevent annihilation.